Your journey.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. I'm Asri from Labor Department. Hi Dato'.
Hello, Tuan Asri. Good afternoon.
Hi.
We can hear you well, and we can see you also very clearly.
Yeah.
Hi, Asri.
Kalau nanti. Okay.
Both pakai ni. Both pakai headphone. Untuk dengar both pakai headphone. Kalau tidak pun kasih dulu. Ni kan?
Hi everyone, can you hear me? We're about to begin, so I would like everyone to settle down.
We can hear you, Narisha.
All right, thanks. Okay, hi and good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on preventing forced labor through responsible business practices. This webinar is jointly organized by the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, also known as SUHAKAM, the International Labour Organization ILO Bridge Project, From Protocol to Practice, a bridge to global action on forced labor, funded by the US Department of Labor, and the ILO Global Business Network on forced labor. My name is Narisha, and I'm from SUHAKAM, and I'm your host for this event. Just to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can put it in the Q&A box, and your answers will be answered either in the Q&A box or later in the panel discussion. So to officially start this webinar, I would like to call on Datuk Ma Weng Kwai, Commissioner of Human Rights with SUHAKAM, to give us a welcome address. Over to you, Datuk Ma.
Thank you, Narisha. I trust everyone can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this webinar. Ms. Bunpala Panuta, ILO Deputy Regional Director for Asia, Ms. Juliet Mitra, distinguished speakers, employers, employees, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow SUHAKAM commissioners. Now, on behalf of Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SUHAKAM, I warmly welcome you to this webinar on preventing forced labor through responsible business practices. I wish to express our appreciation to ILO for the opportunity to work together and become a partner in organizing this webinar. As we work towards achieving the ideals of SDGs, we are mindful of the need to understand and to raise awareness in the importance of business and human rights. The question uppermost in the minds of many people is what amounts to forced labor? Perhaps a short answer to that can be that forced labor may include practices such as restricting movement or imprisonment, withholding wages or identity documents to force workers to stay on a job, entangling them in fraudulent debts for which they cannot escape, forced overtime, and so on. Some may describe it as bonded labor, and others as slavery even, modern slavery, or slavery-like practices. According to the latest global estimates, 16 million people were in forced labor in the private economy in 2016. Now, various forms of forced labor are criminal offenses and a violation of fundamental human rights. In fact, it is against the Constitution of Malaysia. It has a strong negative impact on society, on business, and on the economy. The majority of those who suffer are the poorest, most vulnerable, and marginalized social groups in society. In order to effectively eradicate modern slavery in all its forms, the root causes of forced labor need to be addressed. The majority of forced labor today exists in the private economy. This webinar underscores the importance of states partnering with the business community alongside employers and workers' organizations and civil society organizations to eradicate forced labor. Greater transparency and integration of the global economy has brought the issue of forced labor to the forefront of the international community's agenda. Ending modern slavery will require a multifaceted response, and all actors operating in this context have a responsibility to ensure that forced labor issues and human rights violations are addressed. SUHAKAM has urged the Malaysian government to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery, and combat human trafficking, as well as to protect labor rights and promote safe and conducive working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, and in particular, women migrant workers and those involved in precarious employments. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, addressing forced labor requires a collaborative effort by all parties. Laws, policies, and regulations will not work without effective and robust enforcement. I believe today's webinar will serve as a good platform to increase our knowledge on ways to prevent forced labor through fair recruitment practices, as well as to enable us to share good practices on addressing risks of forced labor, particularly during the recruitment and employment. Please remember, all workers have their human rights too. Respect them. They are not slaves. Before I conclude, let me once again express my sincere thanks and appreciation on behalf of SOHACAM to the organizing committee for their efforts in organizing this webinar. Thank you to all the speakers and participants for taking the time to participate. And on that note, I wish you will all of us will have a fruitful and enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Datuk Ma. ILO, in collaboration with the Malaysian Employers Federation, MEF, has developed several tools for employers on preventing and addressing forced labor. To further elaborate on some of the tips for employers from the Employer's Guide, I would like to call on Jodlyn Mitra, the Technical Officer for ILO Bridge Project, to give us a presentation. Over to you, Jodlyn.
Thank you very much, Narisha, and good afternoon, everyone. So allow me to just share my screen. Can you see? Can you see?
We can see your screen.
All right. All right. So before I begin with my 20-minute presentation, I just would like to say that this pandemic is challenging for everyone, but most especially to the most vulnerable in the society. And this is also an opportunity to build back better based on decent work and sustainable development. And this was highlighted by Dato' Ma earlier. And this includes eliminating forced labor. And this can be done through responsible business practices, which is the subject of my presentation. So very briefly, let me just introduce to you our project. Bridge Project is a global project funded by the US Department of Labor. We started in June 2017 and will finish on September 2021. The overall objective is to support global and national efforts to combat forced labor under the 2014 ILO Protocol and Recommendation on Forced Labor. In Malaysia, we provide awareness raising and advocacy, technical support to research and policy development, including national action plans on forced labor, child labor, and trafficking. And we also support capacity building for different target groups. In terms of capacity building, specifically for employers, we have developed tools such as fact sheet, employer's guide, and facilitators training manual on the subject of employers' responsibility to address forced labor in Malaysia. And we have done this in partnership with the Malaysian Employers Federation. We have also conducted training of trainers with the MEF Academy, and we will soon embark on a series of capacity building activities for the SMEs. So Dato' Ma already mentioned about what forced labor is. I just would like to revisit this. Forced labor is not the same as substandard working conditions. According to ILO Convention 29 on forced labor, it is any work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So any person could refer to a child or an adult, locals and migrants, documented and undocumented too. On involuntariness, this means that the victim did not consent to enter employment freely, or even if there is consent during the recruitment, the person has no freedom to leave the employment at any given time with reasonable notice in accordance to national law. Threat or menace of penalty given by the perpetrators to the victim can be any form of coercion, such as threats, violence, retention of identity documents, confinement, non-payment of wages. The penalty may also take the form of a loss of right or privileges. Just quickly, why should businesses ensure that there is no risk of forced labor in their business operation and supply chain? Well, the first and the most important thing is not related to companies' bottom line. It's that everyone should respect a person's human rights, in this case, labor rights. I suppose none of us attending this webinar would say that they want another person violating their rights. And then, of course, there are the legal and financial risks associated with forced labor. So unscrupulous employers can use forced labor to suppress labor costs to gain price advantage in the open market, to the detriment of the law-abiding employers and enterprises in the same industry who face unfair competition from those who operate outside the law. If you are a law-abiding employer, it will be in your best interest to demand other businesses to also obey the law. Lastly, studies have shown that companies who enforce labor standards have higher productivity and enhanced organizational competitiveness, workers' retention, and improved industrial relations. These are the most common indicators of forced labor based on ILO experience in many countries, and the exact form varies from country to country. These are signs of a potential forced labor situation, and the key word there is signs. In many cases, a single indicator may not be enough to determine if there is forced labor. A report of one indicator, though, could serve as signal for law enforcers to investigate thoroughly for other potential violations. Because if a labor violation is left unchecked, this could aggravate to more serious offenses such as forced labor. Abuse of vulnerability could come from excessive dependency of workers to their employers, language barriers, undocumented status of the worker, and ability to change employment even if there is abuse because, for example, of policies that prohibit changing of employers. Workers may be deceived to the real nature and conditions of their work, or if they do not have clear written contracts from countries of origin. So debt bandage, it occurs when a person becomes a security against a debt or loan, or when debts are inflated to cause the person to continue working. Retention of identity documents such as passports, this is quite common, and we will discuss this again later. So other indicators are also physical, verbal, psychological intimidation or threats, or physical sexual violence. There are also withholding of wages, abusive working and living conditions, excessive overtime and isolation when workers are kept from communicating or interacting with other people. So as businesses, how can you prevent forced labor? Well, the best way is to prevent each of these indicators from occurring in your business. And this can be done through conscious efforts to implement responsible recruitment and employment practices. When recruiting workers, conduct due diligence about who you would like to engage as your recruitment agency. Check their past records if they have had offenses. What are their internal policies? How are they implementing this beyond what's on paper? Do they have necessary licenses? So also conduct strict audits of your recruitment agencies and other sub-agents. ILO has also published these general principles and operational guidelines on fair recruitment, which you could adapt into your company policies. And aside from that, to ensure that the proper documentation of migrant workers and completion of all legal procedures are done. One very important example is you as employers are legally responsible for getting and renewing the necessary work permits of the workers. Then provide fair and transparent contracts in the language that the worker understands. A fair and transparent contract should contain the basic information about the worker, contract duration and conditions of renewal, nature of the work and the place it is to be performed, occupational category, clearly defined regular, overtime, and holiday wage policies consistent with the Malaysian laws, how and when the salary would be paid, bonuses, and authorized deductions in accordance with the Employment Act, and many others. So there should be no terms also barring workers' rights to join a trade union, to organize or engage in collective bargaining. And of course, the grounds on which a contract may be prematurely terminated. There should also be no withholding of workers' documentation such as passport by a recruitment agency or by the employer, which we will tackle in another slide later. So pre-departure and post-arrival orientation should also be done. In our employer's guide, we have provided sample content of this orientation trainings, such as basic information about Malaysia, the job in the workplace, including policies and practices, accommodation arrangements, living conditions and health services, travel and repatriation arrangements, terms and conditions, and the other information such as source country, embassy or consulate information, how the salary will be paid and remittance services, and many others. In this slide, I also added prison labor. In response to questions regarding this among those who have registered, So this is not in the employer's guide, but at the end of my presentation, I shared other ILO materials with links to this. So according to ILO, work or service performed by prisoners in a private undertaking must be voluntary, and prison workers must freely give their consent without being subject to a threat or penalty, including the loss of rights or privileges inside the prison. Conditions of prisoners working for private employers should also be comparable to conditions enjoyed by free workers. For example, prison workers should have access to similar wage levels, social security benefits, and the same occupational safety and health standards. Reasonable differences in wage levels are acceptable on the basis of deductions made for board and lodging. It is important, however, that there is close supervision and monitoring of the labor conditions so that abuses do not occur. So a good risks assessment should be done to determine the feasibility of this option. Wage payments. I would like to highlight that employers should ensure that they comply with the national wage policies on the rates and also the schedule for payment. Payments of wages should be regular or direct to the workers' bank accounts, unless, of course, there's a written request of the employee, other than for the domestic workers, to receive via cash or check. For the domestic workers, the Department of Labor should approve non-bank types of payments. Later, MOHR will also have a presentation of this. If there is an ATM card, this should be held by the workers and not by the employers. Pay slips and other documentation with detailed computation should be provided to the workers, including breakdown of payments for loans or debts. And on wage deductions and in-kind payment, remember that the Employment Act clearly states that no deduction from wages shall be made with the aim of indebting a worker and binding him or her to employment. So only deductions authorized by laws are permissible. And any legally authorized and permissible deductions shall not exceed 50% of the monthly wages of the employee, and the employee shall be informed of the details of the deduction. Employers should also be cautious about providing wage advances and loans to employees. Any advance provided to workers shall be in accordance with the Employment Act, and make sure they do not put workers in a situation where they feel forced to work to repay the loan. Workers must also not be compelled to purchase goods or services from any particular store or service providers assigned by employers. Another issue is withholding part of migrant workers' salary as a deposit to prevent them from leaving the employment, let's say to compensate for annual levy or recruitment cost. This would serve as a pressure to compel the worker to return and to stay with the job. This could be a forced labor indicator, as the worker will have a financial penalty if he or she leaves the job. However, deposits of a reasonable amount in compliance with national laws do not constitute forced labor if it does not deter workers from leaving. The worker should be informed of the conditions for return of the deposit, including, for example, the uniform to be returned in reasonable condition. The very first ILO convention, adopted in 1919, tackled the issue of limited hours of work and provided for adequate rest periods for workers. Today, ILO standards on working time provide a framework for regulated hours of work, daily and weekly rest days, and annual holidays. These instruments ensure high productivity while safeguarding workers' physical and mental health. The imposition of overtime does not constitute forced labor if it is within the limits permitted by the national law or applicable collective agreements. Forced labor would occur if workers are required to work overtime beyond the national law's limits with the threat of a penalty, irrespective of the reason for such overtime. Additionally, this can be an indicator of forced labor if workers are forced to work for more overtime hours other than allowed by law in order to earn the legal minimum wage. The other examples are fear of dismissal, driving workers to work overtime, beyond what's allowed by law, while in others, where remuneration is based on productivity targets, quota, or piece rate system, workers may be obliged to work beyond normal working hours, and as only in so doing, they can earn minimum wage. So this is where, we've mentioned this much earlier, and you should not take your worker's passport or personal documents, nor require them or to give it to you. if needed, you can just take copies of these documents, but workers should keep the originals. Workers should decide based on their own volition whether to keep their passport, personal documents, and valuable items. A good example is having a locker in their accommodation with the key kept by the worker. If migrant workers specifically request the employer to keep their documents for safekeeping, the employer should develop written procedures and designate a focal person to ensure that workers have access to the documents without restrictions and no need to get approval from anyone. Any form of coercion shall not be used to physically confine or imprison workers at the workplace or dormitory. You know, this is also actually an issue of occupational safety and health hazard. Let's say if something happens in the workplace and the worker cannot leave. So do not lock the doors to the workplace or dorms to prevent workers from leaving. Do not use penalties to enforce a curfew, and do not hire security guards to restrict workers' movement. Posting security guards at the factory exits for security reasons is not considered forced labor. However, the inappropriate use of security personnel could be an indication of forced labor and should therefore be avoided and treated with caution. Instead of imposing restrictions to prevent workers from leaving or running away, the best practice would be a proactive workers' retention strategy, creating a fair and happy workplace with trust and respect, clear expectations, and good communication. Employers are encouraged to engage with workers to understand their needs and wants, minimize misunderstandings, and address concerns with specific responses. Adherence to the workers' minimum standards of housing amenities, which was amended in 2019, Sabah and Sarawak labor ordinances and occupational safety and health acts are very important. If the accommodation is provided by employers, the employer should ensure that the dormitories are clean, safe, and provide reasonable living space. Migrant workers should also be able to choose whether to stay in the company accommodation or not. ILO has a recommendation, ILO Workers Housing Recommendation 1961. It provides exception of cases in which circumstances allow employers to provide housing for their workers. For instance, when an undertaking is located at a long distance from normal centers of population, or where the nature of the employment requires the worker to be available at short notice. So at the beginning, while migrant workers are in their source country, they should already be informed about accommodation, any cost involved, and transport options to and from the factory. And employers should also ensure that migrant workers receive proper medical attention in the event of illness or sickness. In terms of disciplinary and grievance measure, so companies should enforce a strict policy against violence, harassment, discrimination, and coercion, and train all relevant personnel regarding these policies. A good complaints mechanism that a company should implement must have strong protection for whistleblowers or complainants. And the company must also actively promote the use of this complaints mechanism. In a way, this is actually the company's means of checking if there needs to be an improvement on their labor conditions in their operations. So there should also be no retaliation for those who complain. In terms of disciplinary measures, they should not include penalty in the form of obligation to work. For example, if a worker violated a company policy, this does not mean that as a result of that, you can impose forced labor on them. There are certain disciplinary measures, though, that would not be considered forced labor. So for example, fines for violations of facility rules such as quality standards and unexcused absences, as they do not relate to whether a worker is being coerced into working, although they may raise other issues, including protection of wages. Lastly, here are some ILO resources on forced labor that are available online. You can Google and find them easily, but we can also email this to you. My last message is to, you can implement these responsible business practices, not just in your company, but in your whole supply chain. Train your suppliers about these practices and monitor how they implement this. This is responsible procurement, and responsible procurement is a responsible business practice. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jodeline. Now we will quickly move on to the panel discussion. We have 5 speakers joining us today. participants, you will have the opportunity to ask questions after the panel discussions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. We actually have two representatives from the Ministry of Human Resources today, Encik Raimi Muhammad Ramli, Senior Assistant Director from the Ministry of Human Resources. Encik Raimi will be giving a presentation today. We also have Encik Asri Abdul Rahman, Deputy Director General from the Ministry of Human Resources, who will respond to questions in the Q&A. Encik Raimi, you may begin your presentation. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Norisha. Thank you also to John Lim for the presentation, which is presentation with the information which is in relation with the presentation that I will be doing afterwards. Distinguished guests, Datuk Ma, Datuk Shamsuddin, and Datuk Rama, and Mr. Kai. Okay, thank you for giving the opportunity in sharing in this webinar. And with me, our presentation is most on the regulation and laws pertaining to the recruitment and also forced labor. And for that, I would like the organizer to show at the screen the presentation. Okay, key laws and regulations related to fair recruitment and forced labor. Basically, for the next slide, please. As we are well aware that the government views the issue of forced labor very, very serious, because one of the reasons is that Malaysia as the receiving country of migrant workers, and due to the fact allegation of forced labor, the government has undertook several measures to combat forced labor. To combat forced labor, there are measures which has been taken. One of the measures is that to increase the labor standard by enacting certain laws, okay, which can contribute to the prevention of forced labor. And secondly, to have a specific laws which deal with forced labor, namely the law on the trafficking in person, anti-trafficking in person, and also anti-trafficking of smuggling of migrant. Next slide, please. The laws that we are going to discuss are Employment Act 1955, the Private Employment Agencies Act 1981, Child and Young Person Employment Act 1966, the latest amendment on the Employment Minimum Standard Housing, Accommodation and Amenities Act 1990, and lastly, the Anti-Trafficking in Person and Smuggling of Migrant Act 2007. Next slide, please. As Jodlin has pointed out that the provision of the Employment Act contribute also to the prevention of forced labor. So talking about the Employment Act 1955, there are several instances where the law has been upgraded in order to prevent forced labor. So one of the items which need to be looked into is the payment of wages. Secondly is registration of labor contractors, the employment of foreign workers, and the employment of domestic foreign workers. Next slide. With regards to payment of wages, the amendment of the law, which has been enforced since 2012, provides that the payment of wages is through bank account, and for domestic workers, wages shall be paid through bank. And just to give an information that for the purpose of the application of migrant workers, we also put into the condition that the employer needs to ensure that the payment be made through bank accounts. And also for the domestic worker, we from the provision of Section 25, that the workers also need to be paid through bank accounts. Okay, so this is one of the measures that has been taken. And some issues pertaining to issues of payment of wages with regards to payment by way of new methods, such as payment through what we call as the e-wallet. So these are actually latest method of payment, but currently it's not within this provision. We are in the midst of studying whether a law need to be amended in order to address such issue. Next slide, please. Registration of labor contractor. So one of the issues which regards to forced labor is that victim which been hired by labor contractors. Okay, so in this issue, the law which has been amended in 2008 provides under section 33A for the registration of labor contractor. This is the objective of this provision is to monitor the employment of workers by the labor contractors in order them to comply with the minimum labor standards. And currently, this law is applicable to labor contractors in the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. And employment of the foreign workers. Okay. Previously, the duty of the employer is to notify the labor department with regards to employment of foreign workers within 14 days. We see that there are certain needs to ensure that not only the employment but the termination is conducted accordingly. They are paid accordingly. So due to that, the law also has been amended by inserting section 60K, which requires the employer to notify the termination of foreign workers within 30 days from the date of termination. Next slide. And the upgrading of the law also sees that for the purpose of employment of foreign workers, also the employer need to notification of the labor department and also the termination of domestic foreign workers within 30 days from the date of employment and 30 days from the date of termination of the employment of domestic foreign workers. This is a way in order to monitor whether the employer comply with the minimum labor standards. Next slide. Secondly, is pertaining to recruitment process, okay, whereby the law has been amended under the Private Employment Agencies Act. So we look into 3 issues, which is
Oh dear,
Raimi, we lost you.
lost voice.
Tuan Azri, can you take over?
Is there any response from Tuan Asri?
Datuk Mano response also from Tuan Asri. It seems like connection issue at MHR.
Okay, then I think I shall step in at this stage. Can I invite our second speaker to start, and then when Tuan Raimi comes back on, he can join in a little later. Dr. Shamsuddin, are you able to start now? As our second speaker.
Yes, Datuk Ma, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Perhaps before you start, a very quick introduction by Nurisha of Datuk Shamsuddin.
Hi, okay, all right. Datuk Shamsuddin Bardan is the Executive Director of the Malaysian Employers Federation. Datuk, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Nurisha. Thank you very much for inviting MEF to be with this particular discussion. And actually with me, I have Tuan Haji Muhammad Audong, the Executive Director of MAPA, the Plantation Employers Organization. And then of course, when we talk about forced labor in the Malaysian context, of course, this becomes very critical, very important of late, because there are sanctions imposed by the international community, especially the US, on some of the Malaysian companies on the allegations of forced labor practices. Let me just perhaps go direct to that particular issue on the allegation of forced labor, whether it is a fair thing actually which is being imposed on the Malaysian companies, on the Malaysian employers. Firstly, of course, we talk about debt bondage. Are the Malaysian employers really responsible for the occurrence of debt bondage? Where does this debt bondage actually occur? And if you look carefully, ladies and gentlemen, actually debt bondage arises from the practices at the source country, where the source country actually encourages the third-party agents to be very active. This happens in Bangladesh and some of our neighboring countries. And of course, in that kind of situation, just imagine if from Bangladesh, a worker wants to come legally to Malaysia, he or she has to spend something like even up to 20,000 ringgit. To me, that is a daylight robbery. And the Malaysian employers are being made responsible for that. So the question is that whether it is fair for the Malaysian employers to be asked to bear the cost that was actually caused by the government and the third parties in the source country. To me, honestly, I had raised this very often, even with the ILO, to say that to make the Malaysian employers responsible to what happened of the, I would say, unfair practices at the source country is also not fair to the Malaysian employers, and especially to say to ban the import of the products of the Malaysian employer that uses that kind of foreign labor is also, I would say, putting unnecessary, I would say, financial burden to the Malaysian employers. Of course, we know that some of the companies in Malaysia have no choice but to comply because of the fact that if they don't comply, then their product will not be allowed to go into certain countries. That I would say is I would say putting unfair burden, and I would urge the international community, even Suhakam, for example, even the Malaysian government and also the ILO to actually discuss with the source countries to say that as the source countries, they are responsible to facilitate the movement of their people to third country, and they shouldn't be charging unnecessary fees. So this means that possibly, to me, I'll be very blunt here, eliminate the existence of third parties. Now, because they are the cause of the misery, they are the cause of the problem as far as the alleged forced labor situation in Malaysia is concerned. And this is nothing to do with the practices adopted by the Malaysian employers here. So I think I want to be very clear on that particular aspect. We don't agree totally with what is happening currently, and we urge the international community to actually relook at the situation and be fair to the Malaysian employers. And secondly, of course, when we talk about some other issues on forced labor currently faced by the Malaysian employers is on the working hours. The ILO still allow 48 hours as the normal working hours. Yeah, that is even in the established constitution. But some of the international communities say, some of the buyers for Malaysian products say, no, you shouldn't be asking your employees to work for 48 hours. And I would say it's not fair because even the ILO say that the working hours is still 48 hours. And of course, the other issue is on the issue of overtime. So what is overtime basically? Are we actually saying that we are forcing the employees to work overtime? If you look at the contract that we have between the worker that come to Malaysia and the employer, the workers and also the sending countries, the embassies of the sending countries even say that you must put in at least 4 hours overtime on a daily basis in the contract. That is more like a contractual provision. And in the event the company here say that, okay, sorry, we can't actually guarantee you 4 hours overtime, then possibly the respective embassy will not actually allow the workers to come in. So, but here we see that as far as overtime is concerned, then the buyers or the international community say that no, the workers shouldn't be working more than 60 hours per week, including overtime. But the question is that whether it is fair, and what is our legislation? Our legislation says that the employers and employees can actually work up to 104 hours overtime. So the question is that, you know, when you look at even the ILO convention, they say that even the ILO convention is subject to the national rules and regulation. So where is I would say, the position of the national rules and regulation? So, and of course, I would say that when that kind of situation arises, then the Malaysian employer is in a very difficult position. Once they say the contract say, you must have a fixed overtime provided in the contract. But if the company say, no, sorry, we cannot enforce that or cannot implement that, then the workers will say, you are breaching the contract. And they even can sue on that particular provision. So again, here I would say that, yes, you know, of course, here the International Committee has to be fair to the Malaysian employer and say, what is it actually that we require? Yeah. And of course, we need to be more transparent on this. And of course, the other part is looking at the kind of other fees that are payable when we are talking about recruitment. We are talking about fair and transparent recruitment. Question is that whether it is really fair and transparent, even at our local country. Of course, I would leave it really to the representative of the Labour Department here, Cik Remy and Hadi Asri, both of them are my good friends, to see whether our recruitment process of the foreign workers as practiced in Malaysia is really fair and transparent. Yeah? And of course, the other part is that when you're talking about accommodation, yes, of course, there are a lot of pressure on the Malaysian employers. The coming up of the new regulation, the coming up of the new laws on housing, I would say that that is also putting a lot of financial constraint to the Malaysian employees, especially when it comes in during the COVID-19 situation. Yeah, so that I think is something that we need to really look at it as to whether it is fair actually to impose a lot of financial burden at a time when companies are struggling to remain in business. Yeah, and of course the other part is that when you're talking about the other part is that, of course, I think, of course, forced labor is something that is not acceptable. And I think it's better for us to really come up with, I would say, a comprehensive approach as far as handling forced labor issues are concerned. This means that, of course, we need to work together with the stakeholders very much. Yeah? And also, of course, the government need to actually really discuss this with all the stakeholders, wherever they want to come up with new policies or new issues as far as forced labor issue is concerned. I would say, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to just stop there for a while. And I would say that with your permission, I would like to actually request or invite Tuan Haji Muhammad to share some of the issues facing the plantation industry.
Yeah, thank you, Datuk Pengerusi Datuk Umar. As far as the employers in the plantation sector are concerned, we are very concerned with the issue on forced labor. Okay, and of course, we are trying our best to address the issue of forced labor. But I think we must recognize this forced labor is very, very subjective. To ILO, maybe forced labor, but as far as the employers in this country are concerned, may not be seen as forced labor. I give you example, say, child labor, right? Now, especially in plantation, right? these parents sometimes during school holidays, for example, the children voluntarily help the parents so that they can increase earnings. That is happen not only in this country, but all in the developing country, not only in Malaysia. So perhaps when we discuss about child labor, we must see the context of that particular countries and the economy of that particular country, so that we have a balance on this particular issue of child labor. That is one. Secondly, as Datuk mentioned just now, overtime. Of course, here, especially in developing country, Malaysia, for example, workers or employees, they try to maximize their earning, and they themselves voluntary to work, working overtime, all right, daily, and it should not be deemed or termed as forced labor. Of course, in terms of other term and condition of employment, we are ensuring all the employers comply with all the labor regulation. Of course, we are maybe one or two employers, but we are going to educate them so that every employers in the plantation sector follow the rule and regulation. For example, the Housing and Minimum Housing and Amenities Act recently introduced or amended by the government. Of course, we are very hard and very serious in advising the employers to observe the new rules. That is as far as the plantation is concerned. I think that's all at the moment, Dato'. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Dr. Shamsuddin, for the your insights into the private sector and ways to prevent forced labor. I'm also very interested to hear your views about trying to eliminate the middleman or the agencies that charge high recruitment fees. Okay, before we go on to the next speaker, may I just remind the speakers we have a provision of 10 minutes per speaker, and we will now call on Dr. Sri Ramashalvam to be our next speaker. Narishma, would you like to introduce Dr. Sri?
Hi, Dr. Sri Ramashalvam is the chairperson of the Migrants, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee of the Malaysian Bar Council. Dr. Sri, you may begin.
Thank you, Nurisha. Good afternoon, Dato' Ma, fellow panelists, fellow participants. Thank you for inviting the Bar Council to participate in this webinar. The areas that I'd be covering basically would be an overview of the migrant workers' situation in Malaysia. As all of you know, there are about 2 million documented migrant workers. There are an estimated 2 to 5 million undocumented workers. We have a very huge number of migrant workers. The undocumented migrant workers form a very significant part of the migrant workers population. They are one of the most vulnerable sectors in our country who are vulnerable to forced labor. Why we have to analyze the whole issue of the migrant worker recruitment, deployment, and repatriation policy in our country. This policy is ad hoc. It is not driven by international standards. This is the only country out of, I think, 83 countries that employ migrant workers in the world, where the management of migrant workers is in the hands of the human resource, in the hands of the Home Affairs Ministry, and not the Human Resources Ministry. The government has to get its act together. It has to overcome the shortcomings of migrant worker recruitment. The policies that exist in our country lacks transparency. It is riddled with unethical practices. in the recruitment process. There are multiple service providers who increase the cost. There is, of course, abuse and violation of rights, weaknesses in enforcement, and so on and so forth. These are some of the broad issues that has been touched. And to zoom in on the topic of the day, what makes migrant workers vulnerable to forced labor in our country? First and foremost is the skill set. Most of the migrant workers in our country are in the low skill, low wage sector of the economy. They are desperate to come here for employment. What has happened is that due to their desperation, and of course is what's been highlighted by Dato' Bardan just now, is the imposition of very high recruitment fees. Migrant workers are burdened with high, recruitment costs. Again, I think it has been now, it is now public knowledge. It comes up to about 20,000 for Bangladeshi workers. It can be up to 6,000 to 7,000 for Nepali workers. The amount that would be almost equivalent in respect of Bangladeshi workers for something like a year's wages. The imposition of significant debts or debt bondage is an indicator of forced labor, according to the ILO standards. Significant recruitment debts would actually be one of those indicators. We have seen this issue blowing up in our country in recent times. We had the WRP glove factory that was sanctioned by the Customs and Border Protection Authority in America last year. This year, we have seen Top Glove being sanctioned by the Customs and Border Protection Agency as well. We have seen the recent actions against FGV, which is the biggest plantation in the world. Other reports, for instance, the Verite report shows the forced labor situation in the electronic industry. This is a 2019 report, as well as the Danwatch investigation. So all these things show that their forced labor is a live issue. We have now seen that Top Glove has now agreed to remediate the affected workers by paying up to 20,000 for Bangladeshi workers, Nepali workers 6,000, and so on and so forth. So this is an issue that has to be tackled. The solution, Dato' Bardan said, the employer shouldn't be made responsible for what happens or the fees being charged by recruitment agents in the home countries or the countries of origin. The solution is to have fair and ethical recruitment practices. That is the international standard. The international standard, again, is this. The recruitment for cost for foreign workers should be zero cost for the workers. And that is what employers have to ensure, that the supply chain of recruitment, so to speak, ensures that workers pay zero cost. The other major issue that we have seen that again is an indicator of forced labor is contract violation and contract substitution. This is something that happens, that takes place. Employers have to ensure that there is no contract substitution, no contract violation. Excessive overtime, again, is definitely an indicator of forced labor. We cannot escape or give the reason that because the workers want to work extra overtime, therefore we are compelled to give them overtime, or we give them overtime, because that would be, working hours should be in compliance with national laws. That is why we have these laws. The other area is identity documentation retention. that is passport retention, is another major indicator of forced labor. And that, I think we have to accept the reality, it's rampant in industries that employ migrant workers. There have been some changes, albeit small, where some of these international companies or companies that do business internationally have started following international standards of providing lockers and so on and so forth. The other area that I'd like to highlight is the area of restricted movement. This is another area that has to be looked into. Many of these factories or industries that employ migrant workers do restrict movement of migrant workers. And this is another indicator of forced labor as well. The other major issue that there's a reason now due to the pandemic is, of course, the issue of wage theft. Employment itself for our national workers is a challenge. Of course, migrant workers are also facing challenges in ensuring that their employment is there. And that has led to a lot of migrant workers being repatriated and so on and so forth. But there has been this issue that is a reason of them not being paid their dues, their entitlements, and so on and so forth. This is something that we should look at. Of course, this issue that has been highlighted by Jordan, the whole issue of domestic workers' rights. In our laws, in our legal framework, domestic workers have been excluded from all the protections, almost all the protections granted under the Employment Act to domestic workers. This is something that has to be remedied and remedied immediately. There's been the talk about regulations that has not happened. There's been the proposal to come out with guidelines that are enforceable. That has not taken place. So domestic work is a very vulnerable sector of work, and the government has to act on this. The other area, as a lawyer, of course, in the Bar Council, that we are very concerned is the whole issue of access to justice and the significant barriers that exist for workers, migrant workers especially, to access justice. This is an area that we need to pay attention and ensure that migrant workers have the right to access justice. In this context, it is important that the government extend the National Legal Aid Foundation in respect of criminal cases and the government's Legal Aid Bureau, as well as missions have a role to play as well to ensure that their nationals can access our justice and grievance mechanisms in our country. This is something that we find that is lacking and that needs to be done on an urgent basis. Without being able to access justice, the migrant workers' rights will not be upheld. This would be,
can you please sum up in a couple of sentences, please?
As far as recommendations are concerned, Dato', I'd like to say that I concur with whatever has been said by Jordan. With that, I thank you, Dato', and my fellow panelists and participants. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Darusli. Some strong views expressed there, but I think I will most certainly join with you and say that forced labor in Malaysia is a live issue. I think we cannot ignore the fact that there are problems with forced labor. It is a practical problem and not just an academic exercise that we are undertaking. Right, so what we should be trying, of course, is to find ways and means to restrict this practice of forced labor. We will now, before we go on to the next speaker, and if Tuan Raimi, are you with us? Are you still there? Oh, right, I see you now. Now we lost you somewhere just now. I think you were coming towards the end of your presentation.
Lost in the space.
Sorry?
Lost in the space.
Lost it. Okay. Welcome back. Okay, if you can just finish off where you left off, please.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to make it sweet and simple because due to time concern. All right. What we did from the government perspective is that to amend the law of Private Employment Act, and we introduced license. We have 3 categories of license. License A, recruitment, domestic recruitment. License B, recruitment of Malaysian in and outside of Malaysia. And license C for recruitment of Malaysian and foreign workers which to be placed in Malaysia. Next slide, please. And also we have upgraded pertaining to the composition of license, the requirement of license. Firstly is company incorporated. Previously, those who are sole proprietor also can apply, but with the current amendment, the company incorporated in Malaysia and need to be 50% share owned by Malaysian director, not an undischarged bankrupt. And the important point is the requirement that the director of the company of not convicted under any trafficking in person and forced labor offences. Next slide. And the placement fee actually has been capped, not exceeding 25% for domestic placement. For placement outside of Malaysia, also not exceeding 25%. And actually the placement of foreign employee in Malaysia is not exceeding 1 month basic salary. This is actually in a way to ensure that the placement fee is not put on higher or exorbitant price. And basically the issues within the jurisdiction is within our purview, but sometimes the issue which has brought up pertaining to issues of exorbitant recruitment fee in the sending countries. This is actually also been is within where we tackle with our counterparts in the source country. And for instance, we have established an MOU with the government of Nepal. So that would be one example of bilateral agreement between Malaysia and also Nepal pertaining to the issues of recruitment and the recruitment fees. Okay, next slide.
Tuan Raimi, I
yes.
see you have a total of 34 slides.
I'm skipping.
I wonder whether you can condense them and because we don't have that much time, if you can condense them in the next 5 minutes, that would be appreciated.
So for the last part, actually, I'm highlighting the current provision of the standard minimum housing. This is important because the issue of non-conducive working and non-conducive living condition is one of the indicator of forced labor. And through our experience, it's shown that there are some employers where they fail to provide the basic necessity. This actually we found out based on our inspection. Okay, the workers are not given actually a mattress. They sleep on the floor. So this kind of situation happen, and we cannot deny that. All right, because of that, the government has expand the provision of the housing standard minimum to cover not just employment previously within the plantation, but now cover all employment. Okay, and construction and renovation also must obtain approval from the local council. Next slide. So there would be permanent accommodation or temporary accommodation or centralized accommodation. Next slide. And the important part is that all of this accommodation must be certified by the Labour Department. So there must be a certificate of accommodation which been issued by the Labour Department, subject that they fulfill the standard requirement as follows. Next slide. Okay, the sleeping areas as per prescribed, and also the lavatory. The area must be in accordance with this standard. Next slide, please. And also to provide basic amenities such as bed, mattresses, pillow, and blanket. Based on our experience, there are cases even the employer fails to give any pillow and blanket. So this is hardly should happen in our country. Okay, next slide. and basic common amenities like drinkable water, electricity, living areas, fan and lighting, kitchen, and also dryad for washing and drying clothes. Refuse bin and first aid, and also dining for dining area with table and chairs. So lastly is on the trafficking, and basically we have a law on trafficking, and in the trafficking provision also they provide for the issue of acquiring and maintaining labor or services. This would actually relates with exploitation. In next slide. All right, next slide please. Okay, and for the purpose of exploitation, the law is very clear. It includes forced labor and services and offenses, okay, which is provided. Next slide, please. Under Section 12, for instance, and next slide. Under Section 13 of the Act. Okay. Next slide. All right, and also the protection of victim of taking providing a victim with the shelter homes, obtaining the interim and also obtaining the protection of order for victim of trafficking for the purpose of exploitation of forced labor. So for that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tuan Raimi. Okay, we will go on to our next speaker. The fourth speaker is Mr. Kai Yao Chua. Please, Narishma.
Mr. Kai Yao Chua is the Senior Program Manager of the Responsible Business Alliance. Mr. Kai, you can now begin.
Thank you, Norisha. Very good afternoon, Datuk Ma and my fellow panelists, as well as participants today. First and foremost, just to convey our appreciations to the organizers for inviting the Responsible Business Alliance to speak here and to share our thoughts. So just give me a second here while I share my slide. Is the slide coming through?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Thank you. So maybe just allow me to take a minute to introduce who we are, because I don't think everyone that is participating to this webinar may know what is Responsible Business Alliance. So basically, the Responsible Business Alliance, or RBA, is a coalition of the world leading companies that's working together to improve efficiency and social, ethical, and environmental responsibility in the global supply chain. So we are basically made up of about 160 members, multinational companies. As you can see here, we are primarily made up of, we started off actually in 2004, and it's made up of, when we started, it was mostly electronics companies, but we have sort of expanded quite a bit now. Looking at companies now, you see some of members like Facebook, Amazon, Walmart, and all that's all part of members right now. So the RBA membership is actually open to companies that manufacture or contract the manufacture of electronic goods or product which electronics are essential to the primary functionality of that product or the supply materials used in the electronics of those goods. So below the Responsible Business Alliance, we also have 3 other initiatives. So what we do is, we set up initiatives because of requests from members for us to look into issues of interest that are particular interest to us. So one of the initiatives that that's relevant to today's topic is actually our Responsible Labor Initiative. So it's an initiative where companies outside of RBA can also join. We have also, in addition to the RBA members who are automatically Responsible Labor Initiative members, we also have companies, that non-RBA member companies that join us. So you could see the companies from the food and beverage, apparel and footwear, entertainment and media, as well as retail companies that's also part of the RLI members. So before we go dive deeper into the issues of recruitment and on talking about fees, we just want to share about, the RBA members, have to commit, once they join the alliance, they need to commit and they are held accountable to a common code of conduct. We of course provide, a range of trainings, assessments to them, and to support their continuous improvement in the social, environmental, and ethical responsibility of their supply chain. We also wanted to highlight the fundamental to adopting the code, is the understanding that the business in all of its activities must operate in full compliance with the laws, rules, and regulations of the countries in which it operates. The code also encouraged members, of course, to go beyond legal compliance, drawing upon internationally recognized standards in order to advance social and environmental responsibility and business ethics. In no case can complying with the code violates local law. So that's very important for us. We're not encouraging any companies to violate local laws. It's very important to note that. In our standards, if there are differing standards between the RBA code and local law, then we would define conformance as meeting the strictest requirements. Just to give you a flavor of what the RBA code contains, it's basically made up of 5 sections that covers labor, health and safety, environment, ethics, and management system. So, for the relevance of today's topic, discussion topics, we're just looking at the labor, and in labor, we've of course covered quite wide areas, including freely chosen employment, young workers, working hours, wages and benefits, humane treatment, non-discrimination, and freedom of association. And what Jodeline has mentioned earlier, as well as I believe Dato' Rama has also shared, is also contained in our freely chosen employment provisions that covers prohibitions of forced labor. This includes, having a written contract in their native language. There's restriction on contract substitution. Being all work must be voluntary and all. Also contained in this provision is what I would like to delve a bit deeper in today's discussion is on this provision that workers shall not be required to pay fees for their employment. So this is a provision that was added and was approved by the board of directors of RBA back in 2015, and it became applicable in January 1st, 2016. So since 1st of January 2016, we have required our members as well as their suppliers to abide by this rule. So in terms of the the zero recruitment fee models, or the worker shall not pay fees model, we have this overarching principles. We have a definition of fees, and that overarching principle is, of course, what I mentioned just now. Workers shall not be required to pay fees for their employment. We understand that there are many drivers of forced labor, but payment of recruitment fees by workers to obtain work is one of the most widespread factors that we see contributing to the situation of forced labor. So there are growing customer demand, there are growing regulatory demand internationally, as well as stakeholder expectation that companies must implement practices in their operations and also in their supply chain that contributes to the elimination of recruitment fees. So basically, which is why we have this principle, and a lot of times this is the first part of it is actually on the compliance side of it. So basically, when we say no worker shall pay any fees, then we expect our members to comply and their suppliers to also comply with that. And however, if we notice that there are fees has been paid, looking back, historically, if fees has been charged and things like that, then there needs to be remediation on those fees that's been paid. So just for your information, in total, there's been since the start of these provisions, more than USD 50 million has been reimbursed to workers by RBA members or their suppliers on recruitment fees. So here I want to delve a bit deeper into some guidance on remediation of recruitment fees. The RBA actually came up with a practical guide, for members on how, what's the best way on when it comes to remediating recruitment fees. As we all know, the remediation of recruitment fee is actually a very complex exercise. How do we determine that the payment is fair? There's no overcharge. How do you determine what the workers is saying is true and things like that? So it's a very complicated exercise, but we came up with a guide, for members and their suppliers. But over here, I just want to share a bit, some of these steps that we have incorporated into the guide. First and foremost, we need to embed, there's responsible business conduct into your policies and management system. Basically, what we're saying here is, if no fees are a requirement, then you must embed that into your company policy. Make sure that you have a clear policy on non-payment of recruitment fees by workers, and this can be communicated internally to all your and to all your business partners as well. And very important that this policy must, of course, be endorsed and communicated by your senior executive, so to give it a legitimacy. Secondly, you need to identify and assess adverse impacts in operations of your supply chains as well as business relationship. What this means is that you need to identify the risk, right? This is the next stage in your due diligence process. You need to identify where your workers, your foreign migrant workers has been hired in the supply chain, where likely how they have been recruited and the cost that they are likely to have incurred, right? Steps here could include, mapping out an operations and your supply chains, understand where your workers are coming from, understand their journey, their recruitment journeys from their home to your workplace. Is there any red flag that indicates there is a risk of forced labor in those steps? Learn about the specific migration corridor. Is it Nepal to Malaysia? Indonesia to Malaysia? Bangladesh to Malaysia? What are the typical fees? You need to understand that before you know what fees are being charged and things like that. And of course, understanding that you can't cover everything, we also advise that you need to prioritize high-risk geographies, high-risk suppliers or recruiters that's further on the ground, so that you can manage those risks. Next is on monitoring and auditing. Once you identify the risk, you need to be able to target, your suppliers, your own facilities, your suppliers, your labor recruiters, where the risk could be, and conduct an assessment on them. So a constant monitoring of the migrant situations, aside from audit, there are various means, it can be done through surveys or worker voice helpline, social media, off-cycle worker interviews can also be very effective when it comes to monitoring of the risk that's been made available, that's present in your supply chain. The fourth one, of course, once you have found that fees has been charged or there's paid, then the next step is, of course, to remediate and conduct repayment. I will go a bit more details on this step 4 in the next slide, but basically this needs to cover how much workers have been paid, particularly when there's no documentary evidence. Also, how do you allocate responsibility for repayment, and developing a repayment plan, as well as communicate those repayment plan to workers that are eligible for repayment. The fifth step is actually on seize, prevent, and mitigating adverse impact. Actually, the fifth and the sixth steps are similar. However, this dives into engagements with your suppliers, because RBA, we're looking at total supply chain. So you need to engage with suppliers. If you're buyers from these companies, your suppliers may not view this favorably, if you're going there alone. But if you have a group of companies like a coalition, similar to what RBA does, a group of companies that conveys the importance of meeting the code and ensuring that there's no forced labor in your supply chain, then that has a more impactful outcome. So basically, you need to engage your suppliers, and you need to engage with your recruiters as well as other stakeholders to communicate, this expectation. The seventh step, of course, is to track and track the implementation of the result. We must have measure, know what measure has been taken, and whether the outcome is there, where you are getting the desired result or not. So So this is also very important to make sure that this is a step that we can use to monitor that there's changes in the recruitment practices that you expect from your suppliers, that you expect on your own facilities, and that the risk of future fee payment is minimized. Lastly, you need to communicate how the impacts are addressed. Basically, this is on reporting and transparency. You need to share, the work that the due diligence and the performance that you have achieved externally with your fellow stakeholders. As I mentioned just now, when on step 4 just now, there's
Mr. Kai, will you be winding up pretty soon?
Yes, this will be my last slide. I can skip the rest. Yeah.
Thank you.
So on this remediation and repayment of fees, for us, when a worker is found to have paid fees, then they should be repaid as soon as practicable, as soon as possible. However, there are also several issues that you need to consider when you comes to repayment. First and foremost, in addressing the repayment as a corrective action linked to non-compliance during an audit. So because RBA uses a lot of audit to determine in non-conformance, and once we have a non-conformance, we need to address those non-conformances. So the second one is, of course, defining a timetable for repayment. As I mentioned just now, it's a very complicated issues. We need to define, how this repayment can be done easily. There are different different severities of indebtedness that we would find out normally during an audit, and to be able to define the timetable for repayment is very important, and to make sure that it's repaid within a certain timeline. We can't take forever to do that. Of course, then the next one is central to this is identifying and estimating how much workers have paid. Of course, there's various ways to do this, particularly in absence of documentary evidence. It is reasonable to then rely on facts that is credible and available, and also based on inputs from the workers as well as third-party information that you can receive on this. Next is allocating responsibility for repayment. Once you do that, make sure who is in charge of repayment, who is eligible, who is what is the amounts to be repaid. Is there any phase payment? Whether if the amount is too large, do you need to spread it out over a period of time and things like that? That needs to be determined. And lastly, of course, one you say that it has been repaid, you need to verify that payment has actually been made, and then made in a and the amount that was repaid is a fair amount that has been done. So I do have a few slides here, but I'll skip through that. Basically, these are some of the questions, frequently asked questions that we receive from our membership, from our suppliers.
Maybe you can address them, Mr. Kai, later during the Q&A.
Sure, of course. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, last but not least, we have Ms. Laura Green from ILO as our fifth speaker. And Risha, very quickly, please.
Laura Green is the Program Technical Officer of the ILO Global Business Network on Forced Labor. Laura, you may begin.
Thank you.
Ms. Green, can I, in your presentation, request you to share some studies or examples from other countries, other jurisdictions, to have some comparison to what is happening in Malaysia, if that's possible. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be able to speak today. I'll also just build a bit on Kai's presentation in terms of remediation, looking at what's occurring in other countries, different practices that have been put in place there. Firstly, I just want to say that as important as remediation is, that it's absolutely critical to focus on prevention. Remediation should really be a last resort. In terms of the due diligence process, ensuring that remediation is built in is an important aspect, but proper due diligence, addressing the risks as far as possible should take primary precedence to avoid that we find ourselves in a situation where remediation is necessary. I think globally we increasingly see that forced labor victims, that they do have legal recourse under the law. However, often they have difficulties in receiving compensation or having access to various justice mechanisms. There are a number of different barriers that prevent them from accessing these legal mechanisms. They vary, of course, in different national contexts. And I think often a lot of the time it comes down to lack of awareness and knowledge of the fact that these may exist, and then difficulty in gaining access. I think it's important to look at the different local barriers that are in place, and to understand what might be preventing victims from accessing justice. In some countries, they currently work in terms of sharing lessons learned from victims who have had experiences in terms of accessing remediation, and being able to build on and learn from these experiences. So there are a number of different ways that we see currently in terms of the different country contexts we're working on remediation. Firstly, of course, in terms of complaints mechanisms, this either at national level, that these are important, and as Jody also shared earlier, at the business level, making sure that workers have the ability to self-identify and to bring complaints and concerns forward. We also see other systems such as national referral mechanisms, which allow state actors and non-state actors to work together, and in non-state actors we would include their trade unions and civil society as well, allowing then the state to increasingly fulfill its duty to protect, but also to work together with these non-state actors to identify and address the complaints. I think, again, as we sort of look to the legal environment, it's important that we see that the laws are also in place to protect the victims. So in many cases, we may see victims are afraid that they might be prosecuted as well if they bring attention to the various violations. So being able to ensure protection for victims against prosecution, and also to kind of de-link their cooperation in terms of prosecuting the offender from the compensation processes. So it's also important that there are legal support mechanisms in place for victims to be able to gain access to justice and remedies. So making sure that there are various entities that can provide victims with the necessary legal advice that they need. In a number of other countries, we also see increasing efforts to mobilize frontline actors. So this including the police, labor inspectorates, and others to identify forced labor. For example, in Peru, we see that they have been training public transport officials to react to suspicious situations. In Macedonia, government has been training the social workers to identify forced labor, be it at border crossings, in refugee camps, etc. So giving the opportunity to intervene early on as well. I think we're also seeing in terms of, both in terms of bilateral labor agreements, but also more generally, joint liability schemes being put in place for employers and recruiters, where both the employer and the recruiter become liable for abusive recruitment and employment practices. So we see this, for example, in the Netherlands and also in some provinces in Canada, where in this case there is more onus on the recruiter to look at the process in which they're engaging in, as well as for the employer in terms of taking the necessary due diligence to prevent any harm from occurring. In a number of countries also in the Asia and the Pacific as well, we see the provision of migrant resource centers. So again, this is an opportunity for migrants to be able to raise complaints, and also that they can seek some assistance in terms of settling agreements. So I think while there are kind of a number of different mechanisms at play in terms of remediation, there are still concerns in terms of implementation, and many of these gaps that need to be overcome. This is both, I think, at company level and also in kind of national environments as well. In terms of many of the benchmarking processes, for example, for companies, they still point out that this is one aspect that is not yet receiving significant attention, and which is lacking. I think what we see from the business network, I think Kai has really outlined an effective process, and a number of the business network members follow something similar, or are even members of RBA as well. We see them looking to engage also in partnership with the suppliers to be able to overcome the various challenges that relate to remediation, and to help them through that process. I think, again, in terms of, for example, complaints mechanisms, what we often see too is that these might be in place, but without a follow-up procedure or a specific procedure in place to be able to deal with these effectively. So I hope that helps to outline what we see in different contexts at the moment, particularly in terms of remediation, and just again to stress my earlier point that it is critical to focus on remediation and on prevention, and later remediation only if necessary, to follow proper due diligence procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So we have actually come to the end of the panel discussion, and without further ado, I would like to call Datuk Ma to moderate this panel discussion. Just to remind everyone again that you may submit your questions in the Q&A box. You may upvote questions you like by clicking on the thumbs up button. So if you see the question, there's like a thumbs up button like this. So you can actually click it, and then we will see which questions you would like to answer. Datuk Ma, I will now share some of the questions that we have received, and you can see it on my screen. Datuk Ma, can you see the questions?
Yes, I can see the questions. There are quite a few questions. Now, what I'm going to do is to read out the questions and address it to the speaker concerned, right? And for our information, as far as representative from the Ministry of Human Resources, I believe the Q&A will be taken by Tuan Asri, the Deputy Director General. Okay, so let's start with question 1. In the context of the pandemic, many employers arbitrarily limit workers' movements, not allowing workers to leave, change employment terms, including on salaries, and refusal to let migrant workers leave employment, either because of the need for labor or because there are no flights out. In this context, where do we draw the line between what is accepted and what is not? Okay, can I firstly perhaps invite Tuan Asri from the Ministry of Human Resources to respond to this question? We have not heard from you so far. Are you there, please, Tuan Asri?
Say hi and thank you to everybody. So to respond to this question, actually there are two contexts. One is during an MCO, we have to abide by this Ministry of Health regulation actually. So in terms of movement of the workers and the people at large. Okay. But on this labor law, I think we are clear on this. If the employer want to deduct or reduce the worker's salary, they have to comply with the labor law. First, I think we already issued this statement on it. Say that during the MCO, the employer cannot just simply deduct the worker's salary without the worker's consent, or the department, they have to report this matter to the labor department, against the labor department. Okay. That's my quick response to this. Can I respond to this previous panelist?
Which part of it, please?
On this, the question that's brought by this Dato' Samsudin and Mr. Rama, Dato' Sri Rama.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Dato', actually on the part of Ministry of Human Resources and then the Department of Labour, we are fully aware on what's happening on the ground, especially on this forced labour issue. at this juncture, actually we identified this one or two companies that were already under this our investigations. And then we found out that some of these complaints, some is true, some is not really true. But I want to urge everybody, actually this employer association and employer particularly, to come out from this comfort zone and discuss actually with our department. For instance, recently we had discussion with, for instance, one particular company that had been banned by this
CBP.
US CBP, and then we identify actually some key weaknesses in terms of process of recruitment, and we have to accept the fact that our interpretation, we cannot rely so much on that if we want to more or less do business with the rest of the world. So even yesterday I have an engagement with this US embassy to identify what are the key areas that can be further enhanced in working relationship with the US and come up with a policy direction to ensure that our practice, our recruitment process, our law is in line with the rest of the world. Okay. So at the same time, we, on this labor amendment and improvement of our labor law, we then pipeline to amending some of our act as shared by my colleagues, Mr. Remy. But at the same time, we're going to more or less revisit our MOU with the sending country. For instance, name it just Bangladesh and even Nepal and so on. Which area that suggested by the Dr. Samsudin, we're going to revisit, for instance, the cost involved in the recruitment process and so on. Should this our employer bear or should this the workers? So, but we want to draw the line, make it clear on that during our discussion. So we don't want that we are involved in that non-compliant with a certain standard and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, we're going to more or less relook and then improvise further on the process of recruitment internally by introducing this in online, this application and so on. We want to more work on this human interference on that. And then so on the same time, with the concern for my minister also, we're going to more or less identify champion. Okay, for instance, for plantation, we identified, for instance, Samdabi. We're going to more or less working closely with Samdabi to come out with a certain level that we are satisfied with. We're going to share that standard that comply with the international standard that everybody, for instance, the ILO and so on, for the rest of industry to come out at level at that same par as the Samdabi, for instance. For instance, from the growth subsector, we're going to more or less identify, for instance, this Harta Lega as a champion of this subsector, and we're going to work on that. Because we want to ensure that everybody, that particularly employer that doing business, whether in this plantation, whether in the subsector of glove or E&E and so on, come to the level whereby we have to comply with this labor law once on social, and then on the social compliant, labor law compliant and so on and so forth. That we realize that we have to improve further. We have to move on because we found from our investigation that we need further improvement on that. Okay. We cannot deny to say that, or we in the denial mode to say that, oh, this our interpretation different because our culture is different and so on.
Right, Tuan Asri, sorry, I think we have to get back to the Q&A session
Okay.
because as far as Tuan Rabi was the speaker for MOHR. I will now ask a response from Dr. Sri Ramashalvam. Can you quickly respond to this one first question? Where do we draw the line between what's accepted and what's not during this very exceptional period of the pandemic? Is this a time where things get lax and therefore workers are in a worse off position? Any sense of the workers, please?
As far as migrant workers or local workers, all of us have been subject to the same, restrictions. But this is an issue that is beyond, that is beyond the pandemic period. It's been the past.
Just 1 minute. I think Tuan Raimi, if not mistaken, can you please mute your speaker? Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, Mr. Dato Sri Rama. Yes.
This issue has been a perennial issue because workers' right of movement has always been restricted. There's also been the issue of the workers' right to leave employment. This is one of those major issues in our country. Our labor policies is that you are employer type. And even when you become a victim of forced labor, you have issues of being able to get another employment. So this is an issue, this is one of those issues that is beyond the pandemic period as well. So that it's got to have, what is got to be there is international best practices and standards must apply. Of course, our laws say that workers have the freedom of movement and so on and so forth. But in practice, this is curtailed. So what is required is robust inspection regimes on places where migrant workers are employed.
So are you then saying, Sri, that notwithstanding the fact that we are in this pandemic time and there are lockdowns, and this means to say that the workers will still have the same rights as before? I mean, there's lockdown, they can't move anyway. So is there a breach on, and so as this is concerned?
No. As I said in the onset, Dato' Ma, during the lockdown period, every person in this country, be it Malaysian or migrant or whatever, we are all subject to the regulations imposed by the government of Malaysia. That is a given. So that's a given. I accept that. Everybody has to comply. The issues that arises is what I said is the larger issue of migrant workers' freedom of movement, the right to change employer and so on, are issues that is been there before the pandemic and the lockdown period, and those issues exist after the lockdown as well.
Okay.
So it's a larger issue, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can move on to the second question. And please, I will ask, after I read out the question, I will ask...
Sorry, Dr. Ma, I may give some input on the first question, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir. What do you want to add to that?
Just on this issue of practicality. Of course, I mean, changing employment from one employer to another, are we blaming the Malaysian employers for that? Are we the one who say that you cannot change your employer? It is the requirement of immigration. It is the requirement of the authorities that actually is imposing that condition. And the employee, when they first come in, they fully know about that aspect. And the embassies of each country also knows about that aspect. So are we saying that now the employees can say, okay, look, you go to any employer that you want. Then only we are meeting the requirements of the right to move. Yeah? So I would say that to blame the employers for a situation where it is beyond the employer's control is something that should not happen. Yeah. And of course, if we really want to actually emphasize on the right to change employment, then I think we need to look into some of the employment practices in overseas. Say, for example, like the EU, for example, they are using the IRIS system, where the foreign worker or the migrant worker come to a specific country, not actually at the cost of the employer. They come on their own cost. And they have the right to choose the employer from one employer A to employer B. And if you don't like country A, they go to country B, country C kind of thing. So, but the movement is at their own cost, not at the employer's cost. But to be fair here, the movement of the employee from the source country to Malaysia as a host country is at the cost of the employer. Yeah, of course, the issue of the payment to the agents are a separate issue. But as far as the coming in, say for example, like the transportation cost, thing like that, are borne by the Malaysian employers. Yeah. So in that kind of situation, is it fair for us to say that, yes, I bring in, say 100 foreign workers from Bangladesh, and when in Malaysia, this 100 can go to 100 other countries. And we as employer that bring them in say, okay, look, you bear a cost just like that. So I think we need to be fair, we need to be practical, and we need to be, of course, when you're talking about fair, ethical recruitment practices, we need to be fair to both the employer and the employee, not just talking about the employees' right. We also need to talk about employers' right. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I think this question one, has to be taken in the context that where the employers follow the terms of the contract and everything is observed, then of course there should be no reason for the workers to complain. I think it is only where it goes beyond the four corners of the contract, and then the employers arbitrarily, without the consent of the worker, go on to do the things that have been mentioned in this.
But to be frank, Dato' Ma, I mean, the Malaysian employers have been unfairly being accused of not allowing the foreign worker of moving to another employer. That
No, I think I don't think it will help if you are to generalize both to say that all employees are in the same category, or all workers are in the same category where they are just complaining. I think we have to look at the individual cases.
No, this basically, to be fair, is a general complaint against the Malaysian employers, not talking about individual employers.
That's why
we have to call a spade, please. Yeah.
No, Dato' Ma,
who is that
on
speaking?
this, I would like to more or less given some opinion on this. I think if we want to draw the line on this,
yes.
I think the question is quite clear, you know. If they because during this pandemic, recent MCO, the government given this green light to the employer, if they're not in the capacity to more or less to retain that workers, especially the migrant workers, they can change this employer. So if the employer follow that SOP, I think no problem with that. But those is not comply with that policy, I think this law will more or less take into that consideration whether to penalize the employer or do further investigation. So, but on this Dato' Rama point just now, yes, that's why I did mention that we want to more or less encourage the employer for those, for instance, in plantation particularly, on the withholding of the passport. Even I already visited many this estate. They already come up with this nice little box to more or less provide to the every each of workers with the key to more or less to keep their passport near to the main office and so on. So that to avoid that prohibit the workers to freedom of movement and so on. On that, we have to give credit to the employer. So we want to discount.
I think your point has been made, Tuan Asri. Okay, I think we have to move on to the second question, and I will just read this one out. There are many individuals operating similar to a private employment agency, clearly without any license. Has the Labour Office undertaken any such prosecution on such irregularities from the time the amended law came into force? Or are there any periodical mechanism in place to counter the issue of individuals illegally supplying labor, especially domestic workers? On this, can we get Mr. Kai to please respond to this question?
On this, my answer is yes. Even with a collaboration with immigration department, we identified those operating this recruitment without this license from our department, and then we further enhance the collaboration from this even the PDRM to further identify this even the spot whereby this kind of person is operating now. And then we also in the communicating with this our counterpart from this mission from this sending country to inform their nationality. Some of them, some of them that come in and operating and supply the workers to this our employer in this country directly. So without go through this authority or without go through this our agency that has a permit that given out or issued out by this our department. But the number is currently is not so significant. But in the pipeline, I think this year alone we already investigate, and under this around 4 or 5 is illegal agent that under our investigations paper. We already start this ball rolling on this. That's all my response to this question.
Okay,
but
thank you.
I also urge Dato',
yes.
We want to urge that public at large, if they have any information, Dato', to come and give the report or this information in order for us to more further investigate this. And so far, it's not easy to catch this group of illegal agency. Thank you, Dato'.
Thank you, Tuan Azri. What about Mr. Kai? Have you any response to this question?
So I believe this question was directed to the Labour Office, but just to add on from the RBA perspective, I mean we're not the authorities, we are the private companies alliance. But in our code of conduct, we do recommend that all the members, if you want to engage the services of private employment or recruitment agencies, they has to be a license. That's at least the minimum. You need to be licensed, and the license has not expired. So that's our expectations.
Right. Okay.
on our code. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's move on to question 3. What are the laws and enforcement SOPs to inspect and audit recruitment agencies, and to what degree does the investigations by Malaysian authorities extend to international recruitment agencies? Where is a blacklist for agencies known to be involved in forced labor practices? Anybody would like to volunteer a response to this?
Dato',
yes.
If I may shed some light on this, with
yes.
our cooperation with our sending country, even we want to more or less come out with a list that approve recruitment agency list, and we want to publish in our website and then the sending country website. In order for this our employer that intend to recruit from certain country can use that list as a reference that recruitment agency or the approved recruitment agency. Because for instance, the recent incident that one of our company had been blacklisted by this US
Hello? I think you have muted yourself.
Sorry,
CBP.
So through our investigation, they use a two mode of recruitment, whereby one they recruit direct from this using this our local agent, and the other mode of recruitment they're using this sending country agent. So on that, we said that if you want to use, make sure that you're using, as rightly mentioned by Mr. Kai, using that approval recruitment agent, whether by this sending country or whether it's a local agent. If anything happen, we can go after them. So to answer to this question, yes, with the collaboration of Immigration Department, we did blacklist some of the recruitment agent and we take out from the system totally. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now, before we go on further with the questions, I have a question myself. I'm dying to ask this. Now, very often we hear that the cost of or rather the fees that workers have to pay are very high. And this is because of the third parties or the agents. They charge a high fee to bring in workers. And I think that, Rama, you mentioned just now about the amount that a Bangladeshi worker has to pay, something like 20,000 ringgit, and a Nepali worker, 6,000 ringgit. Can you please tell us, Dr. Rama, firstly, why is there such a high cost, and where is this money going to? Is this money going to the agencies in the source country, or is it because of the agencies charging the high fee over here in Malaysia? Dr. Rama, please.
Dr. Ma, the short answer is that it goes to both parties, the people in the source countries or the countries of origin, as well as the countries of destination. As I've said earlier, there is what is called a system which is opaque, where approvals, even in our own country, we've heard of approvals costing money. Employers have to pay or agents have to pay a certain payment to certain departments to get the quota and so on and so forth. There are also allegations that payment is also paid to the employers in some instances to secure employment and so on and so forth. Of course, there is this big element of money paid in the source countries or the countries of origin. So that is how to overcome this problem is that the entire system of recruitment in Malaysia has to become transparent. It has to be made as easy as possible for employers. Ultimately, the issue here is this. Employers should not be paying exorbitant fees either, or costs, nor should employees be paying exorbitant costs. The cost should be made known in the countries of origin. The cost should be made known in countries of destination. And there should be no burden, even if we go for what is called the zero cost scheme, it should not become a scheme that burdens employers. So we should have a transparent scheme of payment on both sides.
Right, thank you. I think this really goes to the crux of the matter, does it not? Because with high fees payable by the workers, even before they start to work, they are already in debt, and everything flows from that. You know, so really one of the ways to prevent this problem of forced labor is to make sure that when workers come over to work in this country, they can afford to pay off whatever fees that they are obliged to pay. But when it becomes exorbitant, then the problem starts. Okay, can we then go back to the...
Dr. Ma, if I may interject, the international standard principle that is applicable is actually zero cost to workers. So the workers should not be paying any fee. Any fee, if at all, should come from the employers. And that is why I say the fee should be reasonable, so employers are not burdened either.
Right, but how often can we, is it possible that this is zero cost in practice? Yeah, somewhere, somehow, the poor workers are always burdened with this. I think that's being realistic. Okay, let's get back to the questions. And can you please go back to question 3? Yes, I would like to address this question to Tuan Raimi, although you were not slotted to answer questions because this deals with the laws. I think you're the best person to answer this. What are the laws and enforcement SOPs to inspect and audit recruitment agencies? And to what degree does the investigation by Malaysian authorities extend to international recruitment agencies? Where is a blacklist for agencies known to be involved in forced labor practices? So, Tuan Razmi, what are the laws that are prevailing and any proposals to amend the laws?
Okay, thank you, Dato'. Okay, regarding the law, obviously we already have the the Private Employment Agencies Act 1981. So based on that law, the Labour Department has been given the authority to process license, and for that purpose, we are also been given the authority under that particular law to conduct inspection. The inspection can be a form of preventive in terms of identifying unlicensed agencies, and also those who will be licensed, and to ensure that they comply with the necessary requirement or the condition of the license. So far, we have taken action for those who has actually does not obtain any license under Section 7 of the Act. And just for your information, we have cases pending in court, still on trial for violation of Section 7, meaning that they operate without a license under the PA law. And pertaining to blacklist, it is advisable for the public to look or to vet through from our website and to verify whether they have been licensed or not, because basically those who have been blacklist, their name or the company of the agency will not be in the list of the licensed private employment agencies.
So in
That
short,
would be the current process.
So in short, the answer is yes, you do keep a list or blacklist of agencies that are in breach of the
yes.
practices and the codes and
Yes.
so on. Okay, thank you. I think we are very close to 4:30. Let me just end by asking one question so that our officers from ILO have an opportunity to answer this question. I would just go straight to question 5, and perhaps Ms. Laura Green or Ms. Jodeline can answer these questions. Many refugees and asylum seekers almost automatically or by default end up in forced labor conditions because Malaysia does not formally allow them to work. And how do we remedy this? Yeah, I think it is common knowledge that refugees and asylum seekers are not allowed to work. But of course, again, on the ground, in practice, we do hear of cases of such persons seeking work, and they end up, within quotes, forced labor conditions. So can we have a response, to start with Ms. Laura Green? Any response to this question?
Thank you. I think without being too familiar with the context there, we just need to firstly recognize that, of course, those who are in situations without documentation, without the ability to work, as you say, for the refugees and asylum seekers, that it does put them in an additional situation of vulnerability. They don't then have the means to be able to raise complaints when things do occur. And of course, these vulnerabilities can often be taken advantage of. In terms of remedying this, of course, we need to look to making provisions within the national law. And I think in some of the things that I mentioned earlier, even in terms of just protecting victims when they do want to lay a complaint, to make sure that they are not then implicated or prosecuted themselves, that is perhaps an intermediary solution. But of course, we need to look to remedy this within the national context and to develop applicable laws there. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jodeline, any quick words on this issue?
Yeah, Datuma, I agree with Laura. Lack of legal protection because they don't have the right to work makes them vulnerable to forced labor, and this can be abused by employers, who want to take advantage of the fact that they're not protected by law. And so Malaysia should look into the possibility of giving them the right to work, and maybe there are also procedures that are on. Being looked at right now and how this can make that happen from the government side. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Okay, we are towards the end of the session. Just a few closing remarks. Firstly, of course, I thank all the speakers for having spent the last 2 hours in this webinar. Thank you for your contributions. But I think for the future, what I can think of really is to have a town hall session and to have a debate between the employers and the employees, or rather representatives of the employers and employees, as well as advocates of this problem. People like Dr. Sri Rama and representing the Bar Council and people from Suhakam, to have a real face-to-face physical debate. I think that will be more productive. Somehow when we have webinars online, no doubt I'm told there are 400 plus, 450 people attending this session, but I can feel the limitations when we cannot
talk to each other personally. Now we have heard the voice of the employers through MEF, Dr. Shamsuddin and Mr. Kai. We have heard the voice of activists, Dr. Sri Ramashelvam on behalf of Bar Council. Thank you for the contribution by Tuan Raimi and Haji Asri for the legal aspects of this problem. And so I think we could just end by saying this. I think that for me, prevention is definitely a better aspect than remediation, because the whole topic of this webinar is to look at ways to prevent forced labor and to have responsible business practices, whereas remediation is actually trying to mop up a problem that has already occurred. So with that, I will now call on Ms. Bunpala Panuda to say a few words in closing. Ms. Bunpala, please.
Suhakam Commissioner Datuk Ma Weng Kai, Ministry of Human Resource Representative Tuan Raimi Muhammad Ramli and Tuan Asri Rahman, MEF Executive Director Datuk Shamsuddin Baden, Responsible Business Alliance Senior Program Manager Mr. Kai Yao Chua, Malaysian Bar Council Chairperson of the Migrants, Refugee, Immigration Affairs Committee, Datuk C. Ramashelvam, my ILO colleagues, Lola Green and Jody Mitra, respected participants. I really would like to thank all speakers for sharing your experience, expertise, perspective, and also raising many critical issues that we have heard in the past 2 hours also. I'd like to thank Suhakam for co-organizing this event with us. We also appreciate all participants from government, business sector, workers' representative, civil society, and the academia. I also would like to thank our donor, the US Department of Labor, for providing funding support to the ILO Bridge Project and also co-organizing this event. I listened with great interest the discussion. I think there were so many important real-life issues which you all have raised this afternoon. I hope that each of us here have key takeaways that will be applied in each of our organization. Forced labor, as defined and prohibited in ILO Forced Labor Convention number 29, and also Protocol on Forced Labor. It's really a grave human rights violation. It must not be tolerated. This is why prevention measures are so critical, and I think I have heard loud and clear from many speakers that's how important prevention measures are. And also, this is why due diligence is important. This is why risk assessment has to be done by every employer, and that mitigation measures are implemented. And this is also why we should ensure that potential victims of forced labor have access to legal remedies. You have heard from my colleague Laura Green that this is the area of work that globally many countries are actively engaging ongoing, as this is really important dimension in many countries. And also globally, eliminating forced labor is a key sustainable development goal under target 8.7. This is together with human trafficking and child labor. We must recognize the root causes of forced labor are much deeper and linked to many areas of the development goals. These root causes include poverty and deprivation, lack of education, inequality, lack of legal protection, and also in some cases, like in the case of refugee, is their precarious status in a given country or in a given society. The lack of education is also very often a very important dimension. Therefore, we must think about eliminating forced labor, that we have to be very mindful about many of these root causes. We also have to put human face to it. What are the needs and situation of those who are potential victims of forced labor? We have to look into that context very carefully. When speaking about the SDG target 8.7, countries and organizations are signing up to be part of the Alliance 8.7. And this is the global alliance. This is the global partnership to catalyze action on SDG target 8.7. We focus on scaling up solutions that work. We look into what drive innovations and leveraging, maximizing the impact of resources. Partnership is open to pathfinder countries, government institutions, international and regional organizations, workers' organizations, employer and business memberships organization, civil society organization, and academic. It would be good to see more countries and institutions in our region to be part of Alliance 8.7. A number of previous speakers spoke about the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and the impact on workers and also on business. Clearly, this is one of the unprecedented challenges of our time. We know that the pandemic is heavily affecting labor markets, economies, and enterprises, including global supply chains, and it has been leading to widespread business disruptions. Workers are losing their jobs. We know that vulnerable workers are more likely to get tricked and trapped into forced labor. With more workers likely to contract debts to survive, the risk of increasing debt bondage is particularly important during this challenging time. We should pay stronger attention to some of these particular dimensions as part of our ongoing work. From our side, the ILO has developed technical tools that could be helpful to employers, to workers, to government on preventing and addressing forced labor and protection of workers' rights. The ILO teams in KL, Jody and colleagues in Bangkok, myself and my team in Bangkok, and also many of us in Geneva. We have whole departments in Geneva that work on forced labor. We look forward to enhance our cooperation with all stakeholders. And of course, in the context of Malaysia, I think today we have such a strong commitment from all key stakeholders who have spoken. I'm sure we have many more who are not able to speak today. And we look forward to the next opportunity for face-to-face dialogues and discussion so that we can really build a very strong alliance against forced labor in Malaysia. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to say a few words. All the best. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.
Bunpala.
Sawadee-ka.
Sawadee-ka.
Okay, this draws to a close. Thank you, Ms. Jolene. Thank you, the team from Swakam, Nurisha and Parames, for helping to organize this. I think we can sign off now unless anybody has got any pressing last minute words. Okay, none. Thank you. Bye-bye. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Datuk Ma. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.